What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Sit Down Saturday. And as we approach the part 3 of this Evolution of Takara Masterpiece, I think it's important to look beyond the scope of G1 because they're just not promoting or producing as much stuff from G1 as they have in the past. And a lot of that, at least release schedule-wise, has been replaced with Beast Wars. We're going to go ahead and get started today. We'll have a longer house cleaning segment next week. I just want to keep these videos consistent in the way that they are presented in regard to the Takara Masterpiece Evolution. And with that being said, I think it's appropriate to go ahead and start with our first Beast Wars offering, which was MP Optimus Primal. I'm also going to go ahead and mention where these were produced because I think that's a conversation worth getting into as well. And this one was produced in Vietnam. Many of us who've been buying these things have noticed a quality difference between those pieces produced in Vietnam versus those produced in China, with the large majority of our preferences leaning towards the latter. What this figure did do was introduce the digital painting, which they've used pretty much consistently on the Beast Wars line since. I also feel like we see an increase in the vibrant colors in terms of paint and deco choices. But this figure worked quite well and definitely represented the cartoon model, but also was in line with the toy model. Now, this is mainly because the toys at this point were largely more influenced by the cartoon. The transformations just as simple, but some of the engineering had advanced. So as a result, the original toys were closer, in fact, to what the cartoon image was in the first place. So while I do think that this Masterpiece offering did a great job and walked a fine line between the two, leaning more towards the toon, obviously, I also think that because of the timing of the original figure and everything, that this actually knocks it out of the park. This is in line with what many of us think in regards to the Takara Masterpiece line in pretty much every fashion: aesthetics, paint, materials, build, and engineering. Now, right before I finished part 2 of the Masterpiece line, I was awaiting the arrival of MP36, which was their G1 Megatron, which came out to mixed reviews, largely because of some of the engineering problems that were associated with it. However, in the same breath, and you know I'm not quick to give this company a pass, but in the same breath with this particular figure and character, I think some leniency is due. It's a bipedal robot, after all, that does turn into a handgun. Not an easy feat for anything to accomplish, except for New Age, to be fair. But definitely in regards to their G1 line, they're much more in line with the cartoon than paying any sort of homage to the toy. However, a later version was released with more of the toy deco, and I think that ended up satisfying that fan base. The G1 Megatron toy is another one of those that was a far cry from the character representation on the screen. So as a result, I'm not sure how much of it was wanted, needed, or warranted in order to make a Masterpiece version. Now, this figure was produced in Vietnam as well, but this figure also was known for some breaking issues. Not super widespread, but it did happen. However, in the same breath, once again, that leniency I do think needs to be applied due to the complications regarding the engineering and transformation. But a lot of the decisions that were made in regards to the transformation, especially in the legs, did have that Masterpiece feel, movement, and moment, which ended up pretty much offering another solid release. We also see that upswing going on there with articulation, where that becomes more to the forefront, and we start to sacrifice a little bit of aesthetics in order to do so. But this is really the groundwork for what's to come. Now, we got another Beast Wars offering, which was their Cheetor. Couple things were a little wonky about it to me aesthetically, aside from the design cues, which I'm not crazy about in the first place. But this figure was also produced in Vietnam, but using relatively simplistic engineering methods. And when I say simplistic, I don't want to confuse it with novice or simple in any negative context, because while the transformation was relatively simple in comparison to especially Megatron, but also some of the other ones that have come later on, it had a level of sophistication in regards to its simplicity. Now, here is where we also start to see the breakdown in beast modes being not quite as accurate as they have been with the previous Optimus Primal or with much of the G1. But what it does do is remain fairly faithful to the animated image, becoming a huge improvement on what the original was trying to do. Now, a lot of the things we've been talking about really culminate in this next piece, which was the Masterpiece Sunstreaker. This figure was produced in China. This figure was made well, didn't have huge breakage issues. We do see a little bit of the clumsy finishing regarding the backpack, and I would fair to wager that a lot of that was to create the more dynamic articulation elements, which now become, in my opinion, at this point in Takara Tomi's history, the forefront next to cartoon aesthetics for the most part in regards to what they're producing. However, I do feel like they're willing to make sacrifices to aesthetics in order to pull off the articulation engineering. Very well received, pricey, but people swallowed it, so to speak, because what they got in return was a high quality product. Painted well, sculpted well, few things probably could have been cleaned up a bit better, of course, but even with the high price, the amount of intricate engineering, range of motion in regards to articulation, beautiful sculpt and paint, I would say the consumer base widespread was satisfied. And in many ways, I think that continues with Dinobot, where once again, the engineering was super sophisticated, starts to get a bit complicated and perhaps not as fun, but still in the ballpark. Beautiful deco. The digital paint comes through. High likeness to the cartoon model. Tons of accessories, display base, etc., etc. They really, I feel like, threw everything they had at this. However, we also see a huge price increase around this time, and it continues through with MP Megatron from the Beast Wars line. Once again, a very faithful representation of the cartoon, far cry from the original toy, and this was made in China, as was Dinobot, both of which were really well built and very expensive. But the digital paint came through. The engineering was perhaps not as flawless, but the articulation is there. And this is what I'm trying to get to in regards to following the footsteps being laid here. What becomes the priority? And in my opinion, it used to be a representation of the character overall with a high nod to the animated form from which it came, with great materials, sturdy plastics, well painted, with adequate articulation engineering and sophisticated transformation engineering. And it ends up around this time becoming super highly articulated, super well painted, super well sculpted, with an attempt at 100% faithfulness to the animation, but the sophisticated engineering is substituted for complex engineering in order to accomplish the said looks, and the price increases fourfold beyond what the usual standard is. Perhaps not a better example could be seen than this MP44, which, as many of you know, I still think is the definitive masterpiece Optimus Prime, but that's not to say it's without flaw. Very expensive, and in my opinion, probably not worth its cost, but only you can answer that. Huge emphasis on articulation, huge emphasis on cartoon aesthetics. Sacrifices are made specifically in the back, which are mostly hidden from the front in order to achieve this goal. Whereas MP10 had a transformation that many of us loved and utilized time and time again, this one bit more of a chore in order to accomplish the said goal. This figure was produced in China, and although there was a leg issue that some folks had, it even survived my five-finger death punch, as it were, dealing with my ham-handedness. But once again, we see paint, aesthetics, articulation over engineering, perhaps materials, and perhaps a fun transformation, depending on your point of view, which was followed up shortly thereafter with a Bumblebee that was willing to sacrifice it all for articulation. And what I mean by that is, it's an envelope that becomes pushed, right? Sunstreaker begins to push the envelope a bit, sacrificing a clean, finished look for something that will present well in most angles and get you a ton of articulation. This one doesn't really care about the angles. It tries to nail the chest and head and is willing to sacrifice everything else for the attempt at articulation. And as a result, you get something that widely, I think, looks unfinished, unpolished, poorly produced, and circumstantially expensive, and made in Vietnam. Now, Black Arachnia was also made in Vietnam, but due to many of the character elements, I think was a lot more successful in what it was ultimately trying to do, but still remains true to the current and obvious priorities, which are sculpt, paint, and articulation. But this one is interesting to me because this is an alt mode that, once the transformation is done, never feels quite finished to me. Things sort of lay atop one another, beside one another in order to pull off the aesthetic, but nothing feels like it's purposeful. But with a huge increase in visual appearance over the original toy and a much more faithful representation to the cartoon, along with a pretty fun robot and some pretty decent accessories, I think it was ultimately successful, unlike their Hound, which once again emphasizes articulation over most things. But this one also emphasizes a gimmick over aesthetics and perhaps cost over engineering, which is why the breakage continued to happen with many people in regards to the tailgate. But don't get me wrong, it did a number of things 100% correct, especially in regard to the trajectory of what it's trying to be, or at least trying to have been doing. So aesthetically, it looks good from most angles, if not all, with the exception of the head sacrifice for the gimmick. It's clean, the articulation is there, sculpt is there, paint is there. So in that regard, it's super successful in what it's trying to do. But the build is what really comes into question with this one. Also, the transformation engineering is not quite as smooth, polished, and professional as what I generally expect from this company. Now, on the box, it says made in China. However, according to an interview on TF KFW that I found, there was an interview with Takara Tomy representatives that provided a curious statement about all of this. It says, regarding the QC issues found in Masterpiece Hound, the answer was, regarding the factories, different materials were used in Vietnam, but they were unaware how they would pan out for Hound, as they were unaware of what the results will be. They know of the breakages right now, but no decision has been made for a future re-release or if they will change the factories or materials. And that to me tends to suggest that it was made in Vietnam. However, it's certainly not what the box says. Now, I'm not sure what happened there, and I'm sure there's more to it than what we know, but I don't think for sure it's as clear as what it seems. And as a result, we have what I think is the ultimate Takara Tomy sacrifice: aesthetics for quality. And that is a sacrifice that I personally am not willing to make. And I think we will look back historically and pinpoint this release as a career-changing moment for what Takara does with Masterpiece. Whether that's for better or for worse remains to be seen. And then the last official release that we got was the Leo Convoy. Now, this was also made in Vietnam, and this one unfortunately tends to follow a lot of the suits of what Hound had done. That is to say, it makes an attempt to keep the sculpt, paint, and articulation, as has become their new precedent. But the design flaws that we see beginning around the Sunstreaker release and singularly personified in the Bumblebee release strike again here, which is a lack of ability to clean up the aesthetics for the sake of the engineering of articulation mixed with the sculpt and the paint. Positive to this release is that the build was better than with Hound, as were the materials. But this is the first Masterpiece release that I can remember ever seeing where people have said that the original non-Masterpiece release is just as good for them, which is a tremendous statement being made. It's a statement that speaks volumes. So what does the future hold? Well, an RC and a Tigertron, but hopefully some sort of stability in regard to their approach, and perhaps a refinement of that approach. Aesthetics will always matter. Paint will always matter. Articulation will always matter. Engineering of transformation will always matter. But whereas I feel like they started on a path that was an attempt to find the balance between all of those things, they've somehow ended up on a very imbalanced scale, making things that speak to a very fine-tuned, pinpoint goal while the rest of the ship sinks. In many ways, it's not being able to see the forest from the trees. One of the most interesting things that I realized looking back at doing this was how over the past 11 mold releases, I've only acquired 2 and only bought 1. Shout out to Tyler L. Gifted me the Sunstreaker when he was getting out of collecting. But the only one that I bought was Megatron, which, if we're following our trajectory, was at the very beginning of where this line has now ended up. Where the line goes from here, anyone's guess. But it doesn't seem to be G1 focused anymore, nor does it seem to be focused on balancing the scales of all of the things that once made Masterpiece indeed its namesake by definition. And before we close out, there's a lot of people that helped me with this video, getting me information, especially as to where some of this stuff was made. So I just want to take a moment and thank Jisk, my partner in 4 Dummies, Charles C., Charlie A., Darren, and Andy, who also helps me with Force Fridays. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.